Welcome to the recording of CSC106, Method Parameters and Constructors. This course is designed specifically to dive deeper into the behavior of a class. So we'll focus on more complex topics related to methods, and we'll also introduce what a constructor is. So we have three main tasks for today. We're going to start off talking about methods, and we're going to look at different ways that we can pass information into a method. We'll look at some convenience features that C# has built in. We'll also look at how we can return multiple values at a time instead of only having to return one value from a method at a time. And then finally, we'll start talking about constructors and how they are used to help build an instance of a class. So let's get started with reviewing how we pass information into a method. And then we'll also look at some special situations and some special features that we can use a part of the C# language. So we'll look at how we can pass in parameters, so regular parameters, we'll review that. And then we'll talk about what we call optional parameters. Sometimes methods require information, and we learned that when that happens, we can supply a method with information by using parameters. So a parameter, remember, is a local variable inside of that method. So in this case, we have a method called deposit, where we're trying to deposit some money into our bank account. So the deposit method has a parameter of type double, saying that if you call this method, you must supply the method with a double. So in this case, when we call the method, we're passing in 50. That 50 then gets passed into the method. It gets captured by that local variable, and then we can use it to do whatever we want to do. So in this case, we take that value and we increase our balance. So like I said, remember, local or parameters are treated as local variables. So here you can see that amount variable is accessible by just using its name. So the first new thing that I want to introduce is what we call an optional parameter. And optional parameters are actually very simple conceptually. The idea is this. A parameter, remember, is information required by the caller. An optional parameter is the same exact thing, except that if you don't supply it, it will use a default value. So the way that you create an optional parameter is just you assign the parameter a value inside the parameter list. So in this situation here, if I don't supply a rate, it will just use the value 15. So what does this look like from the caller side? Well, here's an example. I'm calling calculate tax. I'm only passing in one number. So in this case, that 2,000 is being used as the amount, and then the rate is being reserved for that value of 15. However, if I do supply a value like here, I'm saying 2,000, 20, now the rate will be 20 and no longer will it be 15. It will not use the default value if I supply one. So we're going to now jump into our first exercise, which is going to be using optional parameters. So let's jump over to the start here.html and look at what we're doing. So here we are in exercise number 1, and the first thing I want to point out is we're going to be building a product pricing application. And there is a starter solution, so in your lab resources, you want to go to the resources folder for part 1 and grab the starting folder, and inside of that you'll see a solution called optional parameters. So inside of that project, there's going to be a method called place order, and we're going to be basically converting that into using optional parameters. So let's jump into Visual Studio and take a look at what we're dealing with. So here we are inside the starter solution, and if we just take a look at what's going on, you can see first we have some strings declared for just the types of computers, so MacBook Pro, MacBook Air, and Mac Mini. And then in the place order method, it has 3 parameters. It has the computer, whether or not you want AppleCare, and whether or not you want it to be set up for you. So if you look inside the logic here, we're basically just changing the price of the computer based off of the type of computer passed in. And then we add to the price if you want AppleCare and if you want to be set up. So what we want to do now is we want to convert AppleCare and setup into an optional parameter. So the idea is we're going to say equals true. So if you now don't supply a value for AppleCare or setup, they will default to true and they will be turned on. So inside of our main method, let's actually experiment with that. So inside of main, let's call the place order method, and we're going to pass in a computer. So we'll say let's buy a MacBook Pro, and do I want AppleCare? I'll say false. And then that's it. I'll say semicolon. So in this case, we are saying we don't want AppleCare, but the last parameter, we are not assigning it, so it will actually use the default value of true. I could do another one. I could say place order computer 2, and I'll say false, false. So in this case, I'm explicitly saying I don't want either. And in this last one, for computer 3, I'll simply just do computer 3. And in that case, it will be true, true for AppleCare and setup. So if I just go ahead and run this now, you'll see that the output is going to determine and show different prices. So you can step through this logic and figure out what's going on, but you can see here that depending on the price, like for example here, a Mac Mini. A Mac Mini, if we look, is $1,500. Now we said true, true for the default values. So AppleCare goes down, adds $100, so that's $1,600. And then we go down to $50 for setup. That's why we have $1,650. So depending on the combinations you use, it will produce different output values. So far we looked at reviewing how we can pass information into a method using a parameter, and how we can also create optional parameters, which are parameters that have default values. Next, we're going to look at how we can get more than one result back from a method. So we'll look at the return type of a method specifically. So we'll first review how to return normal data. Then we'll look at how we can return multiple pieces of data. We'll talk about output parameters and how we can call methods that use output parameters as a way of returning multiple values. So before we dive into it, let's kind of discuss why a method may want to return multiple values. And the answer is pretty simple. It's because there are multiple pieces of information that need to get sent back to the caller. So for example, let's take int.parse. In this code sample, you can see I'm saying let's create a string that has the value as 1K. And then inside the call, we pass in the 1K and it returns us the conversion from the string to an integer. Now obviously we can't convert 1K into 1,000 because the system doesn't know that. So what should we return? So in a perfect world, we would like to be able to return two pieces of information here. First, whether or not the conversion was successful, and then the converted value itself. So you can first look at the flag to say, hey, was it successful? And if it is, then look at the value that's coming back to me to actually use it as the converted value. So as a reminder, remember methods have a return type. And the return type indicates what type of data that we're going to send back to the caller. And the way that we send information back to the caller is by using the return keyword. Now remember, void means that we're not returning anything, whereas if we put a data type into it, like bool, that means we're trying to send back a bool. However, the challenge to all of this is, what do I set the return type as if I want to return multiple values back to the caller? And it turns out that there's actually many solutions for this. We'll talk about a couple. The first solution that we could do is we could create a class that encapsulates all the information we're trying to send back to the caller. And then at the end of our method, we'll create an instance of that class. We'll put in all the information that we want to package up for the caller, and then we'll say return that object. So when that object goes back to the caller that can look inside the object and pull out all the information they want. So this allows us to pass a lot of information back. Another solution that we could use is what we call output parameters. An output parameter is simply a parameter that is strictly used to send information back to the caller. So you can see inside this calculate mortgage method, the last parameter has the prefix of out. That represents that this is an output parameter, and that if I assign a value to this parameter inside this method, the caller will be notified about that. So as you can see here, total interest, I'm assigning that output parameter to the value of 10240. So that assignment will actually go back to the caller. So how does it work? So once again, here's our signature of the calculate mortgage method. When I call and when I invoke that method, notice what I do. I create an empty variable, so in this case called total interest, and I pass that into the second parameter, but I prefix it with the word out. Notice how this variable has no value at this point, because the whole point of an output parameter is to be assigned by the method itself. So for example, if you look here, you can see we have the same code up top where we're calling and invoking the method. Now what happens is when I invoke this method, we jump into the calculate mortgage method, and as you can see in here, we're dealing with the output parameter. So when I go, I assign total interest a value right here. You can see total interest equals loan amount times 0.20. So I assign it a value, and then when this method returns back to the caller, notice how total interest up here now has a value, and so does monthly payment, because the monthly payment came from the return type. So I essentially returned two pieces of information here. Now going back to int.parse, remember I said it would be really nice to be able to report the status and also the converted value? Well, it turns out that there actually is a method called try_parse. Instead of int.parse, I can say int.try_parse, and two things happens here. First, it returns a bool as its return type. So that's the reason why I'm able to wrap the try_parse into an if statement. The bool indicates whether or not the conversion was successful. So if the conversion is successful, I want the converted number. The way I get that is I use an output parameter. So the last parameter, which is called num here, will be given the value by the try_parse method if the conversion was successful. So inside this first if statement, I could access num, and it would be the value that try_parse returned back to us. So now let's jump back to an exercise and let's look at how we can add methods that return multiple values. Okay, so here we are in exercise number 2, and our goal here is to deal with our bank account again. And in this case, we're just displaying information about a bank account, but we're going to be calling a method, and inside that method, we're going to be using output parameters in order to return a bunch of information about our account back to the caller. So once again, let's jump over to Visual Studio and let's work through this together. So here we are inside the solution for our second exercise, and this is the starter solution. And notice how we have some sample code inside the program.cs, and then we also have bank.cs. So we're going to start in this bank class, and our job is to create a method called getAccountInfo that have the following specs. So there's 3 parameters. And notice that balance and last deposit are marked with these asterisks. And you can see parameters marked with that should be defined as output parameters. So in this case, we should have 2 output parameters, and it should return a bool. So let's go ahead and create this method. So we'll say public bool, which is our return type. We'll call it getAccountInfo. And there's 3 parameters. First is the account number, which is of type string. Second is the balance, but this is an output parameter. So I'll say out double, if I can type, balance. And then I'll say out And this last parameter is of type date time. So I'll say date time, and I'll call it last deposit. So I now have my method. Now inside my method, remember, with output parameters, our job are to assign the values inside this method. And we're just simulating code here. We're just simulating random values. So we'll just assign values. So we'll say the balance is equal to some random value. Last deposit is equal to a new date time object. And we'll pass in some random values here for all the different values. And then we want to return a bool to indicate whether or not our account is active or not. So we're just going to say return true in this case to indicate that our account is active. Remember, we're just trying to simulate a way of sending back multiple values. So here's our method. If we jump back to program.cs, notice that inside of here, our job is to get the account information and then print it. So step one is to get the account information. So remember, if I call bank.getAccountInfo, these two parameters are output parameters. So I need to create variables that can store that. So we'll first say double, this will be for our balance, and we'll say date time, and this will be for our last deposit. Now that I have those, we can call the method. But remember, the method returns a bool. So I'll say bool active account. This will capture whether or not the account is active. And I'll say bank.getAccountInfo. I'll pass in an account number. So I'll just make up a random number. Then my balance, I'll say out balance. And my deposit, out last deposit. So in this case, when I call this method, balance and last deposit will have a value after this runs. So to print it, all I have to do is use this print method that was defined for us already. So I'll just comment that out, and for each question mark, I'll pass in the values. So for is active, I'll pass in active account. For balance, I'll pass in balance. And for the last one, I'll pass in last deposit. So by doing that and running, notice what happened. This value, 24,127.84, that's coming from the method, and also this last deposit date is coming from the method. So all three of these values are coming back from a single method. So in this last section, we talked about how we can return multiple values from a method. And we actually saw two different techniques. First, we could create a class, and then that class would encapsulate all the information that we want to send back. And then we could just return an instance of that class. And the second way we looked at is using output parameters. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about what constructors are. So I want to start off by introducing what the purpose of a constructor is, and then I'll teach you how we can pass information into a constructor and how we can also create multiple constructors. So starting off with some motivation. When we create an object or an instance of a class, we want that object to be fully ready to be used. And sometimes that requires some preparation. So we want to make sure things like all of our fields have appropriate values assigned to it. We want to make sure that if we have child objects, that they all have been instantiated. We want to make sure the class is ready to be used by the caller. And that is literally the job of the constructor. The constructor's job is to make sure the instance is fully ready for the caller to use. And we've actually been using constructors all along, and we haven't even realized it. For example, in this code snippet where we create a new instance of a dog, this part right here, if you ever wondered why we say equals new dog open close semicolon, is because we're actually calling a method. This open close right here is a call to the class's constructor. So the constructor is basically a special method that always runs when a new instance is created. So how do we create a constructor? A constructor looks just like a regular method, except there is no return type and the constructor's name is always the same as the class name. So as you can see, the class is called dog, so the constructor is called dog, just with no return type. So remember, the purpose of a constructor is to prepare the class or the instance to be used by the caller. So for example, in this code snippet, notice how we have a string called breed. And when I create an instance of a dog, there should be a value assigned to that by default. So that's something that we can do inside the constructor. Inside the constructor here, I'm saying breed equals unknown so that when the caller tries to access the breed, it will have some type of value that means something. Now, there are different types of constructors. The first is called a default constructor. And by definition, a default constructor is a constructor that has no parameters. So as you can see here, our constructor has no parameters, but we're doing some basic assignments. We're saying age equals 0, breed equals unknown, and pure equals false. We're assigning some values to these fields and properties so that when the caller uses this, they have appropriate values. Now you may be wondering, because up until this point when we've created classes, we haven't explicitly created a constructor ever. So what have we been calling? And it turns out that if you don't explicitly create a constructor, then the system and the compiler will automatically create a default constructor for you. So by default, properties and fields will actually be assigned to default values. So even if I didn't supply a constructor, age, since it's an integer, would be 0, breed is a string, it would be set to null, and pure is a bool, it would be set to false, even by default, without even supplying a constructor. Now, from the perspective of the caller, really not much has changed. Once I create an instance of this dog, for example, I can still access all the public members of the class. So in this case, I can still assign a breed, but if I were to retrieve the value and print the breed before changing it, I would see whatever was assigned in my constructor. Now remember, a constructor is nothing more than sort of like a special method, and methods have parameters. So in this situation here, you can see I created a constructor that requires a string. So this means that if you want to create a dog using this constructor, you have to supply it a string. And we simply take that string and we assign it to the breed property. Now, if I have a constructor that looks like that only, and I try to do something like this where I create an instance of dog, but I do not pass in any parameter, this will not work, because if you manually create a constructor, the default constructor is no longer created automatically. So there is no longer a constructor that has no parameters, so you literally cannot use it anymore. You have to use the one that is being supplied. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have multiple constructors. So in this case where we have our dog, notice how we have the breed once again. We have a constructor that takes in a breed, and if you do pass that in, we assign that to the breed property. And then we have a default constructor, so that if you don't supply a breed, we'll just assign it to unknown. So we can overload our constructors. There's also another feature called chaining constructors. This can sometimes help with code reuse. So in this situation, you can use a special syntax that looks like this. And what this is really doing is it's saying that if you call the constructor that has no parameters, this syntax, colon this, and then another call to a constructor, this is saying I'm just going to simply call this other version of the constructor and run that logic. So in this case, I'm taking the string unknown and passing that into my other constructor, and then that will be used as the breed, which once again will do the same thing, assign the breed to unknown. So you may be wondering, what is the point of doing this? Well, the point is this. Even though this is a very simple example, notice how I duplicated some code. I said breed equals 2 times here. And as you can imagine, if I were to change the variable breed to something else, then I would have to change it in 2 spots. So there's some duplication here. But by switching to this syntax, I'm now only saying breed once. So if breed changes, I only have to change it once, and this default constructor is then never affected. Okay, so let's jump into our next exercise, which is going to be adding a constructor to our class. So in our last exercise, we're going to be dealing with our bank account again, but this time we're just going to start creating constructors, and we'll also add multiple constructors with different amounts of parameters. So here we are in the starter solution of our last exercise, and you can see inside the main method, we have 3 instances of our bank account, and then we have 3 calls to console.writeLine to print out the values of the bank account. So what we're going to do is inside the bankaccount.cs, we're going to start adding some constructors. So we're going to start off with a very specific constructor. So remember, the syntax is public, no return type, same name as class, and then parameters. So we'll say string, we need a parameter for the account name when you create a bank account. We need a parameter for the date time called last deposit. And then we need a balance. So we'll say double balance. We can also give this a default value if we wanted. To say that if you don't supply the balance, here it would be 0. We'll actually come back to that. We'll take it off for just the time being. So here's a constructor. Now notice right away in program.cs, all of these are now erroring because it's saying there is no constructor that only allows you to pass in no parameters. All of these now require, if you open the parenthesis here, you can see they all require 3 parameters. So if I want to use this, I literally have to do something like this. Let's do it on the last one. I literally have to say, okay, this is our checking. We're going to pass in some type of date time object. So we'll pass in just some values here. And then we need to pass in a balance. So we'll give it a money amount. So now notice how this is no longer erroring because I'm supplying a value for each parameter. So inside this constructor, what I want to do is I want to just do some basic assignments. So I want to assign basically this balance to the balance that was typed in, this last deposit to that last deposit, and so on. Now, I'm not sure if you've been introduced to the this reference, but anytime if I say this dot, that represents the members of the class itself. So if I say this dot balance equals balance, what this means is that this class balance is equal to the balance parameter. So that this reference can help you differentiate between class members and parameters when they have the same names. I can say this dot last deposit equals last deposit, this dot account name equals account name, and then we can also say is active equals true if you call this constructor. Right? We're just simulating with some basic information. Okay, so we have one constructor. Let's create another constructor, except this next constructor is only going to have a string called account name. That's it. So in this constructor situation, I can start off by saying, okay, this dot account name equals account name. Now, for the other pieces of information, I can use default values, or I can use random values that I assign here. So for example, I could say for this dot last deposit, I'll just say whatever time it is now, we'll assign that. And for this dot balance, I could just say, 0, for example. So I could do these same exact things. I could also say is active equals true. But remember, I'm duplicating code here, and I don't want to do that. So I can simply just chain constructors, and I can really get rid of almost all of this. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's chain this. So I'll say this, and I want to call this version of my constructor. So I'll say, okay, let's pass in the account name for the first one. For the last deposit, I'm going to say, once again, datetime.now. And for the balance, I'll say 0. So in this case, I can now delete all of this code, and now there's no more duplication. If I want to change balance to something else, I only have to change it in one spot. And then let's do one more constructor, except this one we'll add as a default constructor. So in this case, there is no parameters, and I'm simply going to just chain. So in this case, I'll say this. We don't know what account this is, so this is an unknown account. We'll pass in a new datetime object, because we don't know when. And then for the balance, we'll pass in 0 again. Now the only thing that may be a little bit different here is, what if I wanted a situation where the account wasn't active because I don't know any information about it? Well, if I'm chaining the call to this constructor up here, is active is being assigned to true. If I want to overwrite that, I could just add that down here to false, for example, because this is going to run before it runs this. So by doing it like this, if you use the base class or the default constructor, we're now going to have is active to false. So if you look at these examples, I can now use the different versions of constructors. So I can use the one with all three. I could use the one that just has a string only. So that one. And I could also use the one that has no parameters. So for the first one, it will jump into this guy right here. It will call this constructor, passing in unknown account, an empty datetime, and 0 as the balance. For this call, since I'm using a single string, the single string will be matched with this constructor that takes in a single string, and we'll simply forward that to the first constructor. We'll pass in the datetime of now and the balance of 0 again. So you could use all of these, and if I run this, you can see some output here. So you can see we have the first one is an unknown account, no balance, some last deposit date, and the is active is false. The college fund, 0 balance again. Last deposit is the time that it is now. And the checking, you can see we're using all the explicit values. So we have checking, it's called checking. The balance is 50,000. The last deposit date is a certain time that we passed in here, and is active is true. So all the constructors are working. Just remember that a default constructor will not be created if you have created an explicit one. So once again, if I delete this code, notice how this is now going to error because there's no longer a default constructor being created. However, if I comment these out and I delete all of these, now the error will go away because now the system is creating a default constructor for us. So let's undo that and undo that. All right, so here is our completed example using constructors. Let's now do a flash quiz. And remember with flash quizzes, just pause the video after I read the question so that you can think about it, and then I'll give the answer after. So number 1, what are characteristics of a constructor? And that would be C, both A and B. So A is a constructor has the same name as the class, that is true. And B is a constructor never has a return type, even including void. That is also true. Number 2, true or false. When you create an object, you can initialize some or all of the fields or properties. Is that true or false? And the answer here is that is true. Yes, we can. We can use the constructor to initialize some or all of the members of that class. Number 3, true or false. You use optional parameters with constructors. So are you allowed to do that? And the answer here is true. I did show you a very basic example in the last exercise of assigning a default or an optional parameter. So the answer is yes. So in this last section, we discussed what a constructor is and why we use them. And we also looked at how we can create constructors that have parameters and also having multiple constructors in the same class. So that brings us to the end of the video for today. I want to say thank you for spending time going through this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class, C# 107.